The woods shouldn't be this quiet. No wind, no birds, not even the rustle of leaves. Just your footsteps, slow, uneven, and something else, something walking behind you. You stop. The sound stops too. The air feels thicker here, heavy with mist and the smell of wet earth and iron. You pull your red hood tighter, but it doesn't help. The cold isn't from the weather, it's crawling under your skin, humming beneath your heartbeat. Grandmother's cottage is still ahead, but you can't see it. The path is gone, swallowed by fog. The trees twist above you like ribs, closing in. Every shadow looks like something waiting to breathe. You tell yourself, it's just a story. The wolf, the warnings, the curse. But stories don't leave claw marks in the dirt. Stories don't whisper your name when the wind dies. Then a snap. A branch breaks somewhere behind you. Low growl. Wet. Close. You turn, but there's only darkness and two eyes. Faint and yellow, watching from between the trees. You can't move. You can't breathe. The smell of blood hits first fresh, hot human. Then the sound, not a growl this time, but something worse. Breathing. Right behind your ear. You run. Branches tear at your skin. The forest moves with you, roots clutching your feet like hands. The growls are closer now, many, circling. The moon breaks through the clouds, full and bright, and that's when you see it. The trail of blood, the shredded cloak, the body. Your body. Because you're not you anymore, are you? You feel the hunger now, the heartbeat that isn't yours. The curse isn't chasing you, it's waking inside you. And when the next scream tears through the trees, it won't be yours, it'll be theirs. This is Little Red Riding Hood and the Werewolf Curse. The forest remembered before anyone did. It remembered the shape of hunger, the slick heat of blood against bark, and the old promise whispered beneath roots. Night gathered as if drawn by a mouth pursed against the sky, and the path a pale vein through black briars throbbed with an unseen pulse. A girl in red would come. She always did. But tonight, the woods stirred first. A voice moved with the fog. It did not belong to the wind, though it borrowed the wind's sigh. It belonged to the old oath, the one taken when villages were candlelit islands ringed by wolves, when mothers hid knives beneath the hearth, and fathers burned green wood to drive out the stench of wet fur. It had waited for centuries, dried to a whisper, then soaked again in moonlight until it could speak. It spoke to a house of stone, squatting at the forest's edge. Inside, a grandmother threaded bone buttons into a shawl the color of old teeth. Her hands trembled, not from age, but memory. She had once walked this path as a child and learned the price of being found. The scar that crossed her collarbone was thin as a white hair, yet deeper than any grave. She had never told the girl about it. She had planned a gentler world. The girl wore a hood red as a clot. It fit her like a vow. When she lifted it, candlelight bled over the lining and painted her throat with a tide mark. Her mother fussed with the basket, laying in black bread, salt cheese, and a vial of man's breath clear spirit to drive cold from old bones. "Don't stray," she said. Every syllable a stitch, fastening skin to skin. Keep to the path. If a stranger speaks, answer nothing. If a shadow beckons, run. The girl smiled, brave and foolish, which is to say, human. "The path and I are friends," she said. The door opened. Night stepped in first. She followed it out. The path accepted her weight with a soft, yielding sound. Ferns leaned like eavesdroppers, and the trees, black column after black column, made a chapel for the moon. It was not full. It did not need to be. Even a sliver is a claw, and claws remember where to close. Somewhere behind the bark, something shook itself, awake. Nails lengthened. Teeth forgot their names. The body's older grammar, written before prayers, uncurled like smoke over water. The scent reached the girl in waves, iron, wet hay, and the faintest sweetness of rotting apples. She slowed. The basket thumped against her knee. "Grandmother?" she called, though she knew better. The forest did not answer with her grandmother's voice. It answered with breathing. The sound came from several places at once, as if the dark had lungs. The girl gathered the hood closer until the red framed her face like a wound too clean to be true. Her shadow, thin as a ribbon, wavered ahead of her, and then a second shadow, broader, walked beside it without feet. "Good evening." The voice was velvet pulled across a blade. The girl froze. The path did not. "Are you lost?" asked the voice. From just inside the trees. She could not see him, yet she knew he smiled. She felt the smile like a thumb pressed to her pulse. "The forest looks after me," she said, but her mouth had gone dry. The voice hummed, pleased. Somewhere deeper, the woods licked its lips. The curse turned over in its sleep. Long before the girl's red hood was ever stitched, the land wore a darker garment. Famine draped itself over fields until wheat rattled like dead teeth. Plague threaded alleyways with a black needle. Winters sank their weight onto roofs until beams bent like spines beneath penance. Out of that pressure, bone against bone, prayer against hunger, something old cracked open and bled. Villages learned a new alphabet. Tracks in mud, prints splayed wider than bear or man, tufts of coarse hair snagged on doors, lambs split cleanly from jaw to rump, as if by a butcher with too many hands. Mothers slept with knives under pillows and woke with nothing but the knife. Men patrolled the tree line and returned with their faces turned away, as if there were shapes that broke the neck to witness. The church named it evil and rang bells until the air shook like water. Hunters named it animal and followed the spoor. The old women named it what it had always been, hunger that learned to stand upright. In the ash of burned cottages, paw prints circled human footprints until the two became a knot the mind could not comb loose. Some said the wolf had learned a new trick borrowed from men. Others, that men had reacquainted themselves with the old. In the Jura and the Black Forest, and all the nameless groves between, something developed a taste for thin song children's voices. It learned how to wait at turns in the path where bramble closed like eyelids. It learned the rhythm of bells and the hour bread cooled on windowsills. It learned that red shows well in snow. When the starving year came, wolves grew bold, but bolder still grew the ones who wore the wolf inside. They were the ones who could eat and never feel fed, who could sleep and still dream with their teeth. They bound their bodies to the moon's calendar with cords of whispered ritual and bitterness. And the moon obliged, shining like a coin tossed into a well-wish granted, debt incurred. At Bedburg, a farmer's field became a mouth. At Dole, mothers counted backwards from 10, and the number never ended. At Gévaudan, the hills themselves seemed to move, and what they carried down into the valleys made new parables of caution that no priest dared speak from a pulpit. The wind learned to sound like sobbing when it threaded certain passes. And somewhere in all that ruin, a child in a red cloak was led into the woods and came out changed. Not in the story's gentle way, with a moral pinned like a brooch, changed as meat changes, from warm to cold, from red to brown, from breath to silence. Her name smudged in the parish book, her blood seeping through the page until the ink blurred to the color of earth. The ashes lifted in storms and settled again. The land wore them like memory, and memory is a trail, if you know where to put your feet. On that path, a thin voice began to sing to the future, and the future leaned in. It smelled of fur and metal and the iron in men's mouths when they bit their tongues not to scream. They built their justice from wood and twine, a stake, a rope, a chair with straps. On tables slick with tallow, men wrote the shape of fear in tidy Latin, hoping grammar would fix what knives could not. The accused were paraded through market squares while children held their breath as if air itself might carry contagion. A man named for stones, Stube, Stump, stood before them with eyes too calm for a sinner. He confessed to a belt that made him beast, to a run that felt like flying, to a laugh that felt like tearing. He told them of fur pushing through skin as wheat pushes through thawed earth. He told them how the spine welcomed its new curve like an old friend arriving without knocking. He spoke of the gift of scent fear smelled like milk gone sour, innocence like crushed nettle, prayer like wet ash. Under the wheel, people say anything. Yet the townspeople looked at the moon that night and would not meet each other's gaze. They had seen, after all, the neatness of the bodies. Animals tear from hunger, monsters from habit. These were arranged like lessons, hands folded, eyes closed, throats smiling red. Another family, a name spelled one way on the writs and another on the stones, swore the curse had braided their blood. 4 of them went to judgment as single as fingers and met the flame like a fist. "It runs in us," one said, and the crowd rocked back on its heels as if a cold wave had slapped their ankles. A curse that liked its home, nested in marrow, would not be smoked out by incense. The judges wrote werewolf because Latin owned no word for what hides inside love and eats it. Between the lines, ink bloomed like bruises. The quills scratched. The rope creaked. Somewhere nearby, a pig screamed because it had the bad luck to be born that day. Witnesses told of a shape crossing fields on 2 legs that were wrong by inches. Of a face that kept forgetting it was a face and remembered it was a muzzle. Of a voice gentle as soft bread that asked children their names, their errands, their shortcuts. No one said the word beautiful, though many thought it. The horror was not in the teeth. It was in the eyes, human, intent, interested. By morning, ashes drifted like late snow. The town swept them into a corner as if dusting were absolution. But the dogs refused to enter that square for 3 days, and the milk curdled under clean cloth, and the hens laid eggs with thin pink swirls like veins. The priest spoke of devils and was wrong only in the number. The trials ended as all such endings do, with papers signed, bodies burned, and a silence so loud you could hear the mice thinking under the floorboards. Yet the curse did not reside in a body on a stake. It had learned their names and liked the taste. It walked away wearing someone else's hands and went into the forest to wash them. The moon, slit thin, smiled. Their cottage leaned as if tired of holding in what it knew. In the hearth, a pot bubbled, though no one fed the fire. 4 voices lived there. A mother whose lullabies had lost their notes. A father with a gaze like a locked door. A boy who laughed with all his teeth. And a girl who never quite stopped listening. Their neighbors said blessings when passing, too quickly, as if words could outrun smell. At night, the hills knelt close. The Jura gathered its ridges like wolves folding forelegs beneath chests. Wind slid along slate and found the chinks in shutters. Inside, the family braided rope the old kind, rough as bark and stubborn as sin. They looped it from beam to beam and called it protection. The knots looked like closed eyes. Children began to vanish between home and church. The path lost them, or the pines ate them, or the river learned new tricks. The village followed footprints that grew confused, as if feet argued with themselves about what shape to be. Behind the mill, a nest of hair was discovered, the strands coarse, ash-tipped, matted with berry and blood. A goat stood nearby, chewing nothing, its pupils wide with the memory of running. Someone remembered the Gandelons had lines carved into their doorframe, crescent, kissing crescent, moon upon moon, a tally of borrowed nights. Someone else remembered the girl's eyes catching light too well. In a place where memory is a weapon, the wrong recollection is a wound. They came with torches, because fire is instruction written in a language even monsters read. The father opened the door before they knocked. He smiled with the wrong part of his mouth. "We are ill," he said. "It runs in us." The mother wept without moving her face. The boy licked his lips and tasted the room. The girl's hands were folded, though her fingers strained against each. Other like dogs at a leash. They were taken to a barn the church would not have them and strapped to chairs with the ropes they had braided. Questions were asked. How? When? Where? Why? The answers were simple as appetite. On nights when the moon sharpened, they changed. Not because they wanted, but because wanting ceased to matter. The skin loosened. The bones rethreaded themselves. The heart learned an older rhythm, the drumbeat that made men dance around fires before there were words for sin. They ran, they hunted, they fed. They returned, wearing a human's quiet, like another animal's pelt. "Cure?" the priest asked, as if the word were a trap. "Moon wanes," the mother said. "Hunger sleeps." It was not the answer they wanted. The village decided what villages decide, that fire fixes what it can touch. They built 4 pyres and bound 4 fates. The mother sang, a lullaby rebuilt from ash and milk. The father watched the sky as if an understanding might drop from it. The boy struggled until something inside him looked out and grinned. The girl did not fight at all. She tipped her head back and exposed her throat, as if to a kiss. When the fire took, a howl rose that made cows break ropes and stones crack in walls. It came from the hills and from the barn and from every mouth that had ever lied to a child for love. In the morning, the ashes were swept, the knots cut down, and the doorframe planed smooth. Yet when the wind caught the house just so, the carved moons appeared again, pale as old scars. The curse doesn't die with its hosts. It remembers the way home. Snow fell late and melted into a gray soup that grew nothing. Bread thinned to a shade of itself. The fields became ribs pressed against the land's skin. Men dug where they had already dug and fed the holes with hope. Women boiled water over fire and called it soup to teach children the taste of endurance. In such years, hunger learns its letters from bones. First went the lambs, then the dogs that had barked at shadows until their throats bled. Cats vanished on silent feet. Crows grew fat, which is one definition of sin. The forest watched with a patience it had perfected. It knew what came next. Hunger does not make saints. It makes scholars of teeth. On a night thin as the edge of a new coin, a woman walked the path with a bundle at her breast. It was not a child. It weighed the same. The moon found her and wrote her in silver across the snow. Behind her, something breathed and did not steam the air. She turned, and the sound turned with her. Not there everywhere. She ran. The forest applauded without hands. The next day, children were warned again. Their mothers' voices cracked on the same syllables they had used all winter, and still the children nodded like reeds in wind. They believed in paths, because paths are human, and children are the most human of us, still certain the world has rules. The story of the Red Hood grew teeth to make the rules bite. Don't stray. Don't speak. Don't trust. The words were good. The world was better at being bad. Hunger worked a different magic on the men. They set traps that caught thin air and found them clawed open in the morning. They tracked prints that changed shape mid-stride, from foot to paw and back, as if the ground itself could not remember what walked upon it. They sharpened stakes and slept with knives upright between mattress and mat. One woke to find the knife bent like a reed and a tuft of hair on his chest, as tender as a lover's gift. The moon fattened, so did the fear. When it rose heavy and round, the village smelled like sweat and prayers. Doors were barred, windows shuttered, hearths banked to coals. In the church, they sang, but the notes went out like candles in a draught. Something padded through the aisles, unseen but not unfelt, and sat in the front pew as if to admire the architecture. That night, the red-hooded girl's mother tied a bell to the latch. It chimed once at midnight and once at the hour between, when dreamers drown and the dead take their second breath. She rose with a stick and the straight back of someone who has buried too many things to bow again. The bell was still, the latch warm. On the path, a trail of crumbs darkened the snow. Not bred blood, drying to rust as it met the cold. Small crescents marked where something had been dragged, a hem, a hood, a hope. The mother followed until the trees drew close and turned their faces away, unwilling to witness. She stopped where the path narrowed to a throat. Something red hung there, swaying gently, caught on a thorn. When she reached for it, it came easy, too easy. It was the ribbon from her daughter's braid. The hunger year ended, as all years do, but it left behind a calendar no saint had written. Some nights were for sowing, some for reaping, some for remembering what the body is capable of, given cause. On those nights, the forest sang beneath its breath, and the song said, "Once you've tasted, you remember." They said the cloak began as a kindness, wool against weather, a bright scrap to keep a child from vanishing into green. But the dyer's hands were not kind. He steeped the cloth in a vat like a well, and the color that came up was too alive to be mere dye. It gleamed wetly, as if the cloak had a pulse. When it dried, it kept the sheen, a memory of saturation. Some colors do not fade, they haunt. The grandmother claimed it had been hers, and before that her mother's, and so on, back to a woman who spun in a hut with no door, for doors keep things out and also in. That first woman wove at night and sang to the thread. The words were the kind that undo knots in the air and tie them in flesh. She met a wolf who was not a wolf and made a bargain. The cloak was the receipt. When the girl lifted the hood, strangers looked twice. The red framed her like a saint's halo cut from a butcher's apron. Men smiled too, quickly, and women frowned too late. Children reached to touch and pulled back, burned by a heat that was not heat. The cloak was warm without fire, heavy without weight. It fell as if it knew how to lie, smooth over curves the girl had not grown yet. On certain nights, the lining smelled faintly of iron and mint, the scent of fresh blood washed in cold water. On certain nights, the hem gathered leaves and cockleburs in patterns too deliberate to be accidental, spelling old letters only seeds and wolves remembered. The grandmother brushed them out with a twig and swallowed hard. "Wear it," she said, "and keep to the road. The forest respects red. It knows what red means." "What does it mean?" the girl asked, teasing, but the cloak tugged at her throat like an answer trying to speak through skin. "It means seen," the grandmother said at last, and did not explain that being seen is a blessing until a beast learns your color. There had been other cloaks, in other cloaks, villages white for snow walking, black for night, green for thicket craft. But red traveled best. It was both warning and invitation, a flag, run up in the mind. Hunters recognized it and set their sights. Wolves recognized it and licked their chops. Priests recognized it and composed sermons about thorns and roses as if a metaphor could stop a jaw. On the night the moon hit bone white, the girl stood before the looking glass and did not find herself exactly. The glass wavered, the cloak held steady. In its surface, her eyes gleamed yellow for a breath and then behaved. She laughed in the small, startled way of someone who has stepped on a stair that wasn't there. The sound did not comfort her. When she stepped onto the path, the cloak drank the dark and gave back a red so deep it seemed to light the road. The trees leaned closer, drawn. Something in the underbrush moved parallel, respectful of distance the way a dancer respects the room. The wind rose, and the hood whispered against her ear in a voice like silk dragged over teeth. Names for the red crowded the mind: carmine, cochineal, madder, rose. But the forest knew the truest one and spoke it without a mouth. It said, blood, not as loss, as lineage. The cloak did not merely cover. It connected, backward through mothers, forward into hungers not yet born. At a bend where the path narrowed to one set of footprints at a time, she paused. In the hush, the cloak's hem lifted, though no breeze stirred. It pointed yes, pointed into the trees. A game, perhaps, or a command. The girl followed. The forest smiled with all its leaves. At Versailles, the chandeliers trembled with 1,000 captive stars, and the mirrors multiplied every mouth that lied. Perfume masked the smell of sweat and sickness, and silk hissed like snakes when the courtiers moved. Here, where the world was staged to look kinder than it was, wolves learned a new trick. They stood upright and bowed. The girls. The story reached these halls as a curio, an ancient rustic warning, displayed like a moth pinned in glass. A gentleman writer with a powdered wig and perfect pen revised it for polite throats. He filed down teeth and called it elegance. In his version, the wolf spoke graciously. The girl's naivete wore a fashionable ribbon. The devouring happened off stage. Blood was considered gauche. Yet the palace had its own forests, dark rooms, locked cabinets, gardens designed like labyrinths where the hedges listened. Hunters wore lace, and prey wore rouge. Behind the tapestries, whispers grew fur. Servants vanished between wing and wing as if the corridors were throats. A laundress was found folded into a copper tub, her face washed clean of everything but fear. The steward signed a discreet paper, and the tub was emptied into the ground. On a certain moon-slashed night, the king's dogs howled without stopping. Their paws bled against marble that offered no scent, only reflection. A maid, sent to soothe them, returned with the back of her dress in ribbons, though her flesh bore no cut, only 5 long blanched marks, as if terror itself had scratched her. She would not say what she had seen in the mirrored hall, only that in the central pane, among all the copied faces, one did not belong to anyone in the room. The writer, called upon to read his tale in a salon, smiled into the candlelight. He read about a wolf so civilized he could pass at court, and the ladies laughed too sharp, like breaking threads. He did not know that in the audience sat a man who had inherited a ring of fur sewn invisibly into his wrist, a family relic treated with oils on nights when the moon hung fat as gossip over the fountains. He tapped the fur as he listened, his teeth set silently, then eased again. Later, the writer walked a side path where statues pretended to be gods, and gods pretended to be stone. Music from the ballroom softened into air. He stopped to admire his reflection in the black water of a pool, and found another face watching from behind his shoulder, his own, but tilted, with eyes that understood the order of cutting. When he turned, the path was empty. When he faced the pool again, the reflection had moved closer without his body moving at all. He arrived home flushed with wine and applause, wrote the savage out of a paragraph, and never noticed his hand shake just enough to blot the margin. The next morning, a rumor passed soft as silk, the kind that bruises. A countess's child had been found with small crescents on her throat, too neat to be anything but a lesson. The mirrors were polished twice that day. In every one, the girl in red walked a forest no gardener could tame. Versailles taught the wolf a courtly step, and taught the story a mask. It could not unteach the moon. The world diminishes by increments. A candle guttering, a step taken, a question asked. So too did the wolf eat not with a single bite, but with the slow exclusion of light. He knew the ritual of kindness. He knew which words opened throats like doors. He found the girl where the path narrowed, and shadows stitched themselves into a cloak of their own. "Good day," he said, tone draped in velvet. The voice turned her head, as gravity turns the sea. He asked small questions. Where are you bound? Whom do you love? What do you carry? Will you share? Questions are teeth if you set them right. Her answers came mild as milk. The wolf rearranged them on his tongue, tasting the map they drew. A grandmother alone, a cottage with a window always cracked, a bell that chimed when the latch lifted, bread that could be broken, and a girl who had learned listening as a courtesy and never as a weapon. "Such a long way," he murmured. "Such a heavy basket. A pity there is a longer, rougher road and a shorter one, soft as moss." He gestured toward a side path that had not existed until he pointed. Forest, obliging, pulled back its briars. A track appeared, inviting, dappled, green with the promise of being first to know a secret. "But Mother warned," she began, and the wolf tilted his head so the light found the kindness in his eyes and not the calculation. A tickle brushed her throat. The cloak's tie drew tight, as if the red wished to hold her like breath. "Your mother knows the longer road," he said gently. "All mothers do. I am offering you mercy. Mercy is the wolf's favorite word. It smells like meat." He paced beside her, not touching, intimate as warmth in winter. When he laughed, she felt it along her bones. He showed her flowers she would not have found alone. He named them foxglove, monkshood, wolfsbane. She plucked them with a child's avidity, not hearing the list's litany, glove, hood, bane closing like a fist. Each petal was a soft sound bitten back. Each stem snapped like a choice. "Tell me about your grandmother," he said, almost shyly. So she did. She described the hands that had learned to shake only after they had done all their necessary work. The wolf's breath deepened. The path brightened. Birds spoke less. Leaves stilled. She did not notice that she had stopped walking. He did. He stepped closer. His scent, iron, resin, wet root, filled the gap between her heartbeat and her next thought. He lifted a flower to her lips. "A taste," he suggested. The blossom brushed her mouth. The mouth trembled. The cloak tightened again, a parent's hand on a child's shoulder. But she, eager to be brave, untied it and let it fall an inch. Then more. "Careful," he breathed, adoring. "You'll stain it." The way he said stain made the word sacred. She smiled, flattered, and already chosen. When she turned to retrieve a fallen ribbon, the wolf slipped away soundless, carrying her steps in his pocket. He went by the longer road and arrived while the light was still thin. A polite caller with a bouquet of names that could kill. He smoothed his face, as a mask is smoothed to fit. He knocked. Inside, the old woman who knew the difference between weather and warning lifted her head. Her scar prickled like frost. The bell at the latch did not chime. The wolf's smile did. Seduction is not love. It is the appetite learning manners. In that lesson, the forest held its breath. Far from gardens and mirrors, under eaves furred with snow, two brothers gathered stories as if they were tinder. They held them to the light, blew carefully, and watched how each caught. From mouths chapped by winter came old words worn thin with use. The brothers thickened them with shadow. In the telling, some things returned that had never been permitted proper burial. In their version, the girl arrives too late or just in time. Timing is a blade with two edges. The wolf has already made his bed of someone else's bones. He lies among lace and linen, as if innocence were a garment he could wear. The girl, smart in some drafts and less fortunate in others, remarks upon the unfamiliar geography of her grandmother's changed body. Eyes, ears, teeth. The litany tightens like a tourniquet. Then comes the cut. Where the courtier's quill refused gore, the brothers took up the knife gladly. A hunter, passing by chance, by fate, by apology for all men who came too late, hears a sound that is not a human sound, and yet he understands it as need. He enters. He draws his blade. He opens the wolf from sternum to shame. Out spills a red, wet grammar, and within it, impossibly intact, the old woman and the girl slide slick into breathing again. They are wiped clean and set upright, while the room forgets what it has seen. The brothers called it rescue. Others called it a rite. The idea that a body could be a swallowed house and that a knife could be a key, this pleased something older than religion. In the villages, they nodded. In the woods, something else nodded back. Afterward, in some tellings, stones are sewn into the wolf and his body stitched closed. When he wakes, thirsty with the ache of hunger, he staggers to the well. He drinks and drinks, taking into himself the heavy truth of what he has done. The stones drag him down. He drowns as quietly as a secret. The water closes over, untroubled. Yet the story does not end with drowning, because curses do not end with one good death. The red hood is washed and hung to dry. The wind lifts it and learns its weight. The girl, perhaps thinking she has learned enough, sleeps. The grandmother sews. The hunter sharpens his blade, not because he will use it again, but because tools are kept honest by readiness. And in the thicket just beyond the yard, the bushes keep the outline of a body that lay there longer than it should, the grass flattened like prayer rugs. The brothers wrote their versions into neat black type and set them in rows like soldiers. But in the mouths of those who told the tale aloud, resurrection sounded less like miracle and more like debt. Something had been taken from the wolf and placed back into the girl. A memory of the inside, of the dark that is warm, of being breathless and yet hearing a heartbeat big as a drum around you. She would carry it not as trauma alone, but as knowledge. On nights when the moon peeled itself raw, she would wake and touch her belly and find her hand trembling for no reasonable cause. Resurrection, in these stories, is not mercy. It is the clause that allows the curse to continue. There were families who did not sleep well and never said why. They lived on hill shoulders and in valley elbows, places the land itself seemed to cradle and correct. Their children learned to walk early and to run earlier. Their teeth arrived sharp, then dulled, then sharpened again with a patient rhythm that made mothers count days on door frames and fathers drink in barns where the dark could not see their faces. They called it moon fever when they spoke of it at all. The fever did not burn skin. It cooked hunger. Ears found far sounds. Eyes gathered light. No lamp had given. The scent of bread across a field arrived as if sung into the nose. From a distance, the afflicted looked blessed quick, keen, beautiful in the way knives are beautiful when they catch the light. Up close, you could see the music beneath their skin and know it would not be tamed by lullaby or law. Midwives felt it first. They had hands that read bodies like books and thumbs that remembered where to press. In some newborns, the pulse ran double. In some mothers, the afterbirth stank of pennies and pine. Don't name it, the midwives warned, because names are invitations and curses are polite enough to accept. In a farmhouse with a roof patched in 3 different centuries of shingles, the girl's mother folded the red cloak into a chest that had once held grain. She pressed lavender between the folds, the way a person presses prayers. She had married into this house. She had not married the story, yet the story had married her. On certain nights, her husband's jaw set in a line too close to a snarl. His dreams made the bed jolt as if running had replaced sleep. In the morning, his wrists bore half-moons notched into the flesh, as if hands his own had held him down with awful tenderness. Blood runs true, the grandmother said. She spun wool while she spoke, and the wheel whispered like a warning. The scar on her collarbone shone pale as frost. She had taught herself not to trace it. The girl laughed and said she would never be anything but herself. The blood listened like a teacher, correcting softly. It had opinions. The blood, it recalled a body being opened and a life restored, and kept a ledger of what that life owed. Owed to whom? To hunger, perhaps. To the forest. To the voice under the wind that had been whispering since the first time a person looked at night and understood it was not empty. A traveling scholar once came through with a trunk of pages and a flask that tasted like fern. He spoke of humors and vapors, of bile and phlegm and black dog moods. He had no word for the itch that begins at the base of the spine and ends in a howl. He stayed 2 nights and then left, declaring the family sound in limb and mind. The dogs followed him to the edge of town and would not go farther. Something past that line made their tails fold. When the girl bled for the first time, the cloak fit better. It lay along her like a secret agreeing to be kept. Her mother's face changed and did not unchange. In the mirror, for a breath the girl's eyes flashed, the color of candlelight seen through amber. She blinked. They were dark again. The bloodline acquired its own weather. Storms arrived when the calendar said sun. Calves were born with teeth. Milk soured if left too near the east window. And on the night the moon filled itself to roundness, someone put a bowl of water by the door and found it trembling, though nothing touched it. The grandmother closed the shutters. "Sleep," she said, and then, softer, as if speaking to the blood instead of the girl, "Stay." The blood smiled in its bright, blind way and waited for the door. Fields dress themselves all season for harvest and never choose the hands that will undress them. In Bedburg, rye bowed under a wind that carried the smell of river and rumor. Men sharpened scythes. Women braided straw. Children ran between shocks of grain, vanishing and reappearing like thoughts. Above them, crows drew their familiar hieroglyphs across the sky. The first body was found where the field met the wood, a boy who had gone to retrieve a lost cap. His throat told the story before the adults could speak it. The cuts were too careful, the teeth too exact. A wolf is a messy teacher. This one wrote with a clean pen. Stalks around him lay flattened in a ring, and beetles worked diligently at the edges of absence. The priest arrived with oil and a face that pretended to be father to all suffering. He anointed, he intoned, he looked over his shoulder into the trees. Then, a woman, heavy with child, did not come home. Then an old man whose wife had already evacuated the world by dying followed her into its borderlands. Then the farmer, who had named every cow as if names held cows to life. The path learned to refuse footfalls. The bells learned to ring without rope. When they took the man called Stump, he did not plead. He described a belt gifted by a thing that wore the moon like a grin. "When I strap it on," he said, "the world becomes honest. In honesty, blood sings aloud, and fur is only hair that remembers." He told them of flesh that yields if you speak to it sweetly. He told them of running until the horizon fit into his mouth. He told them he felt loved by the night in a way no church had managed. They put him to the wheel and taught his body a language of breaking. Words came, and whether they were true or not, their shape fit the holes Bedburg needed filled. Yes, the children. Yes, their smallness. Yes, the heart first because it is the warmest thing. Yes, the belt. Yes, the pact. Yes, to everything, until the word itself lost meaning and became only a sound teeth make when they come down soft enough to keep the screaming company. They burned him where the road forked, so all travelers could choose which ash to step through. The smoke clung to laundry and thoughts. Wives dreamed that their husbands' mouths contained fur. Husbands dreamed that their wives slept with their hands folded as if in prayer, but under the prayer clause. And yet the killing did not stop precisely. A wolf with a scar above its eye was seen limping along the hedgerow, and every man who saw it swore later that the scar matched a mark on a neighbor's temple. A girl was found alive in a ditch, her red hood balled in her fist like a clot. She would not speak, only pointed to the sky and shook her head, as if to say the moon had nothing to do with it. But the moon always has something to do with it. Even absent, it leaves its negative in the mind. In the tavern, where fear ferments faster than apples, someone whispered that belts are only stories men tell to pretend they need help becoming what they already are. In the church, someone else whispered that stories are belts that buckle around whole villages. They cinch until breath changes shape. The crows learned new routes. The fields stood up again. Bread returned to tables. But in Bedburg, when a dog howled, a mother's hand would move before her mind, crossing the child's throat with a thumb, as if sealing it for later. Graves do not keep what they are given. They bargain. In a village where the churchyard leaned into a hill like a sleeper into a lover, certain stones were carved with crescents that hooked toward each other, twins' jaws about to close. The stonemason, paid in grain and silence, hammered by daylight, and refused work when the moon was strong. He said it was a superstition older than his chisels. He said the shape kept things from rising. He never said what the things were. On those marked graves, grass grew short and stubborn, a bristle more than a blanket. Dogs skirted them with apology in their tails. Children dared each other to leap across the stones and then went home and vomited neatly into hedges, as if their bodies understood what their pride did not. Sometimes a corpse resurfaced, as they do when water reconsiders the earth. The mark would be gone, or so faint it might be a trick of light. Then the sexton would wake at night to a sound like soft digging where no spade moved. He would take a lantern, and the flame would shrink as if trying to hide inside its own small heart. He would find only the shape of disturbance, the way a bed holds the ghost of a body after it rises. Within the cottages, other marks appeared. A child with a crescent birthmark at the base of her scalp grew to hate combs and to sleep best near doors. a woman found a curved white line along her ribs where no blade had ever lain and covered it with her palm as if keeping it from hearing. A man woke with 2 pale arcs on his chest, right and left, as if someone had pressed cold moons against him until he cooled. He stared into the wash basin until the water stopped recognizing him. The grandmother remembered an older carving, not 2 crescents, but 1 full moon split by a nail. "It turned bad luck away," she said, though her voice made luck sound carnivorous. She touched her collarbone where the silver scar lived, and the girl watched her fingers linger. It was used in places where the dead did not behave. "What is behaving for the dead?" the girl asked. "Staying," the grandmother said, "or going, not the between." The red hood lay across her lap like a sleeping fox. On a certain night, the moon swelled to the window's exact size and peered in. The mark on the grave at the yard's edge shone faintly, a damp gleam like breath on glass. The girl, sleepless, stood and looked out. She saw for the first time how the moonlight loved that mark, palming it, almost with a tenderness that felt obscene. In the hedge, something turned over and sighed, satisfied. Later, walking the path, she found the same sign carved, almost hidden, on a tree. Fresh shavings lay like curled teeth at its foot. She pressed her thumb into the groove. It was not deep, but it was determined. Behind her, a branch creaked in the still air, and a weight shifted without revealing itself. The stonemason died in his chair one afternoon, head tipped forward as if listening. In his pocket, they found a little crescent of bone, whitened and polished by the inside of a hand. It had not come from his body. No one could say from whose it had. They buried him beneath a plain stone, and in the night, someone scratched a moon into it with a nail. Marks speak a language. The body hears before the ear. The moon writes in it. The forest reads it aloud. They did not vanish all at once. Villages are stubborn. They die by layers. First, the bell rope frays and is tied with a red rag. Then the mill wheel turns slower, as if remembering another river. Then doors learn to stay ajar even in rain, and hens roost in the rafters of empty rooms. The forest waits, polite, until invitation grows from neglect. On old maps, the names remain: Saint-Étienne-des-Fouilles, Low Cross, Bridewell, Under Beach. A cartographer scratched them carefully in brown ink and dried the page by the fire. When he returned, a curl of heat had blotted 3 letters into a bruise. He redrew them. The bruise returned. He folded the map and went to bed with the taste of metal under his tongue. The people left because harvests thinned, because wolves grew bold, because winter wrote its name inside their chests. Also because, at night, the paths slipped sideways. A woman walked to the well and found it had moved 12 paces into the trees. A child followed his father's shadow and discovered it belonged to something that did not understand how to look at him without licking its lips. Men stood at the village edge with torches and watched flames lean toward the wood, as if a draft issued from between the trunks, a breath too regular to be wind. When the last family of Saint-Étienne packed their saints and spoons, the grandmother knelt on the threshold and pressed her palm to the worn sill. The wood felt warmer than the sun could make it. "It has a pulse," she said, almost pleased, almost horrified. "It wants." Her son lifted her gently, but when he straightened, his hands smelled faintly of musk and wet fur. They walked away with the forest stepping beside them in perfect silence, like a mourner who has learned courtesy too late. Years later, a hunter cut through Low Cross and found the chapel half swallowed. Ivy had pulled the roof into its throat. The altar, stone, lay tilted like a tongue. On the wall, a painting remained, a girl in red offering a loaf to an old woman. A paw had smeared the wet paint before it dried, dragging the red across the old woman's mouth. In the corner, a bowl of water trembled, though no footfall shook the floor. He drank and could not quench. He left and could not stop listening. Bridewell Under Beach went last. Its well had been famous, cold in August, sweet in March. One autumn night, the moon found the well and sat on it like a crown. People woke to a sound like a slow song, sung without words. In the morning, no footprints crossed the dew. Doors stood open, beds were made. A pot of milk steamed as if awaiting a hand that would not come. Only the red kerchief of a little girl snagged on a nail tight, as if someone had tied it to resist being lifted, told the truth that refusing is not always enough. Travelers avoid the lost places, but the forest does not. It moves into them like a widower into a second marriage. Tender, patient, hungry in a way it will not discuss. The paths cross there now, where they did not before. The moonlight lays its bones along the rooflines. The stones warm at night like skin. If you listen, you can hear a bell swing without rope, calling what remains to prayers that have learned new words. The wolves attend, so does the red. Before the cloak belonged to the girl, it belonged to the woman who would be called mother with pride and with dread, often in the same breath. She wore red for reasons no priest could bless, to be seen by what needed to see her, and unseen by what feared the color because it told truths too clearly. The hood framed her face like an oath. The hem told the ground where she had been, and dared it to pretend otherwise. Her first child came in a March storm, the house bracing under a sky that had eaten its own light. The midwife arrived with water that steamed, and hands that had learned long ago to speak more gently than mouths. Red Mother bled like any woman, and unlike any woman. The blood ran brighter, as if a candle had been held behind it. The midwife whispered the old phrases in a cadence older than scripture, and the window rattled as if wanting to hear better. The child, a daughter, opened her eyes and watched the rafters as if they were a canopy of leaves. The mother laid her to breast, and outside, something padded by the door and did not scratch. It pressed its side against the wood, and the door rocked like a cradle. The grandmother living, then stood and pressed both palms to the latch. She did not lift it. Mothers learn the weight of certain choices just by breathing near them. In the summers that followed, the Red Mother hung the cloak on a line and watched it argue with the wind. It had opinions. It turned toward the trees when she turned toward the house. It gathered burrs from plants no seamstress would touch, as if wanting to dress itself in the forest's small teeth. She brushed, put them out with patient fingers and a stick of ash. The stick sometimes smoked as if it had been near fire when it had not. Men admired the Red Mother with the politeness reserved for a blade in the same drawer as needles. They brought her river fish and gossip and held their hands carefully by their sides. One, bolder or hungrier, followed her into the birch stand and asked if red meant promise or warning. Yes, she said, because both are true. He kissed her and scraped his lip on the edge of her laugh. Blood spattered her chin. She wiped it with the back of her hand and put that hand flat to the birch. The trees shivered as if a fox had coughed beneath its bark. The second child did not live. A small thing with perfect nails, delivered under a moon that had bitten itself to a crescent. The Red Mother wrapped the baby in a scrap of the cloak's lining and carried it to the place where the path narrows and promises are made without words. She set the bundle down and waited. The wind went out and came back altered. When she lifted the cloth, it was empty. In its folds, a tuft of fur no larger than a thimble glowed like a coal. After that, the Red Mother spoke to the forest as if it were a neighbor she could neither invite nor banish. She asked it for safe passage and payment plans. She asked it to count her worthy as enemy or as kin. The forest listened. It has manners when it chooses. When the daughter grew into her hood, the Red Mother tied it with hands that did not shake. Keep to the path, she said, and meant keep to the line between hunger and mercy. If a voice calls you sweet names from the shade, call it by its true name. The girl smiled, a weapon she had not yet learned to use. What is its true name? She asked. The Red Mother did not answer aloud. She kissed her child's brow and left the word on skin, a heat that would flare when needed. It tasted of iron and thickened the air. The word was not wolf. It was the older word for want. There were bargains the church made that it did not record in any ledger bound in calfskin. These were agreements inked in ash and closed with silence. registered not on paper, but on the tongues of those who had to keep them. When the moon swelled into a red coin you could buy death with, certain doors stayed unlocked by order of men who never touched the latches. The pact began the year the bell did not ring, and still the villagers assembled trembling, as if called by a voice shaped like fear. The priest, who loved God in the correct ways and wore his hair the correct length, found a visitor waiting at the altar, a man whose hands were too still, whose nostrils flared very slightly, as if scent were information more urgent than sight. He did not bow. He did not need to. The priest saw, in the way candles leaned toward him, that this was one of the moon's men. "Speak," the priest said, "because language is the only weapon some men are allowed to carry." "Let it happen," the man replied. "Let the taking be done where eyes can count, where hands can be kept from making a mess of it. In return, we will keep the number small. It is a wicked proposal until hunger sits at your table and eats the names of your children in your hearing. The priest says no and means yes." He draws a circle of salt around the font. The visitor smiles and steps over it. The priest learns that some circles can only keep out what cares to be kept out. They made their pact with small gestures. The church door unbarred on certain nights, the east window unlatched, a bowl of milk set on the step which cats would not touch. In exchange, the forest kept away from the schoolhouse, and the wolves, those who wore pelts under their skin, and those who wore skin as if it were clothing borrowed from a friend, walked past the cottages of women who had lost sons to the river and did not understand that loss comes in many shapes. A monk from the city came once to audit souls. He found the parish orderly, the graves regular, the accounts balanced. He tasted a copper note in the air and called it old pipes. He asked whether anyone had confessed unnatural hunger. The priest smiled with the bottom half of his face. "We all confess hunger," he said. The monk left a page of indulgences and took a loaf of bread. On the road, he felt watched and called it weather. On the red nights, the moon's color bled into the holy wine. The priest drank and felt it warm a part of him he had promised to let freeze. He unlocked the door. He lit no lantern. He stood in the aisle and listened to a breathing that was not his. When it was done, he locked the door. He washed the steps with water that flinched. He slept like a man who has paid a debt. The villagers learned to lie to themselves tenderly. "We have been spared," they said, and did not ask at what cost. Mothers counted heads and found them complete, and if their hearts tallied differently they argued with those hearts, and won by not listening. The forest honored the agreement, as far as it amused it. The wolves kept their word, as far as wolves keep words. They understood the shape of enough, and ignored it when the wind blew from the east. Pacts are bridges made of bones. They hold until they remember what they are. He did not change like lightning. He changed like weather, slowly, then all at once. In the mornings he woke with his tongue dry and his teeth too tender, as if they had dreamt of harder work. The girl's father stood by the basin and avoided the mirror's eye. Behind him, the window grayed with dawn. Outside, the world rehearsed, being innocent. He kept records in a notebook no one saw. Dates when the moon grew unreasonably persuasive. Days when the scent of his wife's hair made the back of his throat ache in a way that had nothing to do with love. He documented the itch in his palms that no herb soothed, the way he counted passing children. Without meaning to, the way a sparrow's small bones spoke to him through glass. He used careful words, as if neatness on paper could domesticate the wild within. At supper, he chewed too long. Meat turned to paste, and paste to a taste he could not name. He smiled at his daughter and saw, for a flicker, the slick dark of her as she had been the day she was cut free of him blood. Vernix, fists clenched against the heir's rude arrival. He loved her more than his own pulse. He wanted, briefly, to put her entire hand in his mouth and hold it there, safe. He excused himself and vomited quietly behind the woodpile, while the dog watched with a knowing that was not contempt. Sleep became a forest he did not dare cross. He lay awake and listened to his heart changing its beat to something older. He covered his ears and heard it anyway, resonant through bone. When he dreamt, he ran. When he woke, his calves burned and his nails were packed with dirt he could not account for, he told. Himself, he had risen to check the shutters. He told himself many things. His body smiled at the lies and sharpened them into claws. On market day, a butcher's stall undid him. The smell came first, an argument he lost without speaking. The red laid out in neat fans, the ropes of link, the floss of fat, it was sacraments in an alphabet he had forgotten he could read. His jaw flexed. He closed his eyes and saw the pale column of a throat with blue lines threading it like rivers. Something inside him tipped its head back and sang a single note too low for his ears. His bones heard it fine. He went to the priest and did not kneel. "I am too," he said, and the priest, who had unlocked doors, understood too well. "You are one thing learned twice," the priest answered. Sacrilege wrapped his mercy. "Choose the name you can live with," he offered the host. The father took it and tasted wheat, wine, and a third flavor fur. On a night when wind pushed the clouds around like furniture, he walked to the edge of the forest and set the notebook under a stone. "If I vanish," he wrote on the first page, "tell her I went out to teach the trees her name." He undid the first button of his shirt. He unhooked the moon from his throat. He stepped forward and let himself be named back into the grammar of hunger. The girl woke and went to the doorway. The red cloak stirred on its peg, as if a breeze moved through the house alone. She knew, without learning, that something had changed permanently in the way water changes once you've dyed it, even if you cannot see the color. She put her hand to the door and felt warmth on the wood, as if a body had just leaned there, listening. Inside, a place had been made for the wolf. It fit. That was the most terrible part. The convent lay where the road forgot itself, a chalk-white huddle of walls and prayer. Sisters moved through the hours as bees move through clover, and their hum kept the world precise. They laundered the sky in bowls of song. They mended the horizon with thread pulled from their sleeves. They believed this would be enough. When the pestilence came, they opened their doors as if opening their arms. The sick laid their heads on straw and pressed their fever into linens washed, dried, folded, and washed again. The sisters sang louder. The walls learned to sweat. In the crypt beneath the chapel, where air tasted of stone and drowned candles, an older breath woke. They had buried a girl there once, no vows, no habit, only a red ribbon braided into her hair by hands that could not help themselves. She had been brought to the convent after being found sitting in a field, mouth stained with berries that had not grown that season. "Child," the abbess had said, and the girl had laughed like an animal that has discovered a new way to use its teeth. She died quietly 3 days later, as if satisfaction had taught her how. Now, with the sick above and the hymns cut thread fraying, the earth shifted. Bricks remembered their kiln. Mortar remembered the river it had been. The sisters felt it as a heaviness in their knees when they knelt, a tug in the rosary's beads as if someone counted along from below. "More light," the abbess whispered, and candles flared, then guttered, then flared again. Unwilling, a novice sent down to fetch oil did not return. When they found her, she was not dead, not precisely. Her limbs had arranged themselves into a language none of the sisters could read. Her jaw was bruised where it had fought itself. Between her teeth, a thread of cloth redder than any dye lay like a vein. They pulled gently. The cloth kept coming, yards of it, ending in a knot the size of a heart. After that, they prayed with doors bolted and windows latched. Still, scratches appeared on the inside of the shutters. Still, the bread cooled too quickly, as if a mouth had blown on it. The bell rope stirred with no hand to scold it. Animals avoided the courtyard but slept pressed to the outer walls, leaving fur and warmth as if paying tithe. When the fire took the convent accident, lightning, God's side people came from the village with buckets and grief. The roof collapsed with a relieved sound. Flames read the library's spine and learned the story faster than any sister ever had. After, when the heap steamed and the smell braided itself into hair and would not wash free, men went down into the crypt to count the dead and make the numbers behave. They found chains looped through stone rings, rusted to the color of dried cherries. Some links were bent, as if by wrists that had remembered how to be paws. Bones lay in careful lines and in careless heaps. Skulls were gnawed at the base, as if hunger did not care to wait for the easiest entry. In one niche, a child's skeleton curled, and in the hollow of its ribs, seeds had sprouted pale shoots that withered when touched by air. They sealed the crypt. They lifted the charred beams. They built a chapel again, because people are brave like that. Above, they placed a new altar. Below, something turned over and faced the wall, as a sleeper does when the light finds eyes that cannot bear it yet. The sisters who came after sang truly and without knowledge of what their voices soothed. The stone sweated less. The ribbon, buried, bled through the earth in little red threads that moles carried, nose by nose, across the yard. Her icon shows her with a cat and a sheaf of grain. Gentleness painted into gold. In the hymn the sisters sang to her on fasting days, Saint Gertrude watched doorways and kept mice from sacks. But an older verse lay hidden in the margins, writ small in brown ink that had once been read. It named her Keeper of Thresholds and Friend of the Lost, and asked her to close the mouth that opens in the night. The hymn was found under a loose board by a girl who could not sleep for the sounds the wind learned to make. She traced the letters with a finger that smelled of kitchen ash and wild mint. The melody, when she pieced it from the pricked notes, moved like a candle flame down a corridor, wavering, stubborn. She sang it softly into her blanket and felt something at the window step back one pace, not offended, merely considering. The next day, the abbess said nothing when the girl copied the verse into the chapel book. She had heard the old ones speak of a time when hymns did not flatter God, but bargained with the dark. We are children again, she thought, and felt shame and relief at once. They sang it at Vespers. The air around the altar cooled to cellar temperature, pleasant and unseasonal. A shadow that had been leaning in like a curious ant straightened, politely. The words were simple enough for a child, and too simple for men who love architecture. Saint of doors, it began, lock what loves our sleep. No theology troubled it. It named the forest as a cousin to the churchyard and asked both to behave. In the final line, it asked for the read to be read correctly, not as invitation, but as a warning. Those with a certain hunger would misunderstand by design. When they reached that line, the candles burned taller, and a cat that had not been seen in months slid from beneath the altar and blinked at them, as if to say, it had always been here, only smaller. They copied the hymn again and again until a dozen hands held it. Then winter burned the paper thin at the edges of the world, and one by one the copies vanished. Used to light a stove, pasted to a wall under a saint's picture, and forgotten. Eaten by a mouse that built a nest that smelled sweet when it burned in spring. The words went back to where words go when their mouths are closed, but not entirely. Children hummed it without knowing, as children hum things that kept their mothers alive. Old women set bowls of milk on doorsteps, not for cats, but for something that disliked to be forgotten. Men who had learned to sharpen knives, softer on certain nights, paused and laid the blade flat until a last note finished in a room they were not in. When the girl in red left the house, the hymn threaded itself under her cloak, a seam that held though hands would pull. The forest listened. It does not respect all prayers. It respected this one enough to answer with restraint, which is to say, it smiled and waited, and when it spoke, it used her grandmother's breath, and when she did not run, it approved. St. Gertrude remained on the wall, mild, gilded, harmless to eyes that prefer their saints declawed. Behind the paint, the older saint stood with a key in one hand and a leash in the other. The leash ran off the edge of the panel into the dark. At the far end, something sat down obediently and panted. Patient is love. Some say blood forgets. It does not. It remembers in pulses and urges, in sudden shivers that do not belong to the room. When the girl slept, she dreamed of teeth that were not hers, closing over stars until the world went dark. The dreams came without faces, Only hunger had a shape. Her grandmother called it the inheritance. Not gold, not land, not sin. Just the way the moon could pull a soul sideways through its own skin. She told stories of ancestors who howled not in defiance, but in recognition, their throats tuned to a chord older than speech. It travels by blood, she said. Like memory, like music. The girl laughed and said she preferred lullabies, but the next morning she woke with dirt under her nails and pine needles in her hair. Scientists came later, long after the bones of wolves and men had mingled into the same earth. They drew her family's blood into little glass tubes and spun it until color became data. Mutation, they said. Residual instinct. They did not notice the light flicker as they spoke, or how the metal tables shivered as if something had moved beneath them. They recorded what they saw and ignored what they felt. In the evenings, the girl walked the fields and listened. Sometimes, she thought she heard words carried in the hum of insects. Remember, remember, remember. At the crossroads where the forest began, she would stop, her body leaning before her mind consented. Once, she found a print in the mud that fit her bare foot exactly, only deeper, as if she had stepped there twice, once in flesh, once in something older. The blood is an archive no scholar can read without consequence. It stores every running, every feeding, every grief. When it opens like a mouth. The girl felt it stir the first time she tasted rain that smelled of iron. Her pulse stuttered and returned, altered. She did not see the moon that night. It saw her, and that was enough. The centuries wore shoes. Streets replaced paths. Glass replaced water for seeing oneself. The wolf put away its fur and learned passwords. It smiled from profiles, its eyes lit by screens that made everyone the same shade of pale. The girl in red became a username. The forest became a feed. Still, the story persisted, translated into pixels and notifications. She met him in a chat where voices never had to prove their faces. He wrote with charm honed by repetition. The modern grooming of trust. Compliments clicked like traps closing. He asked small questions, the same old catechism of names, errands, shortcuts, now dressed in emojis and care. She answered, because connection feels safe when it glows. He promised to meet her in daylight, but daylight online is a rumor. The messages arrived later, darker, shaped like invitations. She declined. Declining is not protection, it is provocation. Soon her phone breathed beside her pillow, whispering with the tone of her own heartbeat. He sent a photo. A wood path. Empty. Waiting. She lived in the city, yet somehow the air in her room smelled of pine. The wolf does not need proximity anymore. It only needs attention. When she blocked him, another account appeared, with her picture as the icon, smiling a degree too wide. Her friends received messages she hadn't sent. Come to the forest, they read. I'll show you what the moon taught me. Someone laughed, deleted, forgot. Someone else clicked the link. In the morning, the sky over the city carried a strange sound, half siren, half howl. People filmed it. Views multiplied. A hashtag trended. The story began again, because stories are contagions perfectly adapted to the new host. Us. The moon learned code. Its light filtered through routers and algorithms, shaping moods, pulling tides of thought instead of water. Each night, millions stared into it through glass rectangles, their faces silvered. It studied them, patient. Predators once relied on scent, now they used data. Every like was a footprint, every pause, a sniff. The girl scrolled at 2 a.m. Red hood traded for red notification dot. The screen's glow slicked her skin with the same ghostly pallor once given by moonbeams. Stories appeared tailored for her alone. Ads for cloaks, knives, travel to wooded retreats. Somewhere, something had correlated her pulse, her fear, her lineage. The algorithm hummed like distant wolves coordinating the hunt. She posted a photo, half face, half shadow. Comments arrived. Beautiful, feral, come run with us. The language was playful, the timing precise. The line between flirtation and invitation thinned until it breathed. At 3:12, a message appeared. The path is open. Outside, traffic paused. Dogs barked without reason. She looked up, expecting glass. The window reflected her face, framed by a ring of white light screen or moon, impossible to say. Beneath the hum of the city, she heard the old rhythm of paws on soil. Data has appetite. It consumes patterns, recombines them, creates models that predict desire. In that predictive space, the wolf lives comfortably, waiting for consent disguised as curiosity. She closed the laptop, but the sound continued inside her skull, a low frequency, ancient, instructive. She understood then. The moon no longer needed the sky. It had found her through Wi-Fi. Excavators in the Jura Hills uncovered a layer blackened by fire and older than the oldest map. Within it, rings of stone circled pits of ash threaded with teeth, human and not. The archaeologists labeled it ritual. The villagers who brought them coffee called it return. They found small charms carved from wolf bone, each etched with a spiral that seemed to move under touch. They found knives whose edges still smelled faintly of pine resin and blood. They found a child's shoe fused to a wolf's paw print by the heat of an ancient pyre. The report omitted that one of the crew refused to enter the trench after nightfall, claiming the soil shifted like breathing. Fear leaves artifacts. It fossilizes in posture, architecture, superstition. In these hills, houses still face east, away from the tree line. Cellars have hooks in, ceilings with no historical use. The locals say the hooks are for herbs. No one hangs herbs. When the girl in red visited the dig with a class of students, she lingered by the pit. Wind moved over it, as if drawn down by thirst. She thought she saw movement, a shimmer, but the air was still. The professor explained chronology, tools, context. Words are veils. Beneath them, something older waited, patient as ever. That night, she dreamed of digging with her own hands until her fingers met fur instead of clay. She woke with nails packed with grit. The next morning, the trench had filled itself an inch deeper. The archaeologists blamed rain. The villagers nailed their doors and stayed quiet until dawn, which arrived thin and red as raw meat. Storms gather where stories end. The forest, long patient, called its debts. The girl grown now, aware of her blood's whispers, walked the old path again. Not lost, but summoned. The cloak, rescued from a chest, draped across her shoulders, like a confession rediscovered. It fit perfectly. Curses are tailored that way. The trees bent toward her, remembering. The wind carried voices from every age, trial judges, hungry mothers, priests who unlocked doors. Each voice said her name differently, but all meant the same thing: come home. At the cottage, dust lay thick, but the hearth was warm. On the table sat a loaf of bread too fresh to be old. "Grandmother?" she called, though she knew the woman's bones had long been measured by worms. A reply came, soft, familiar, near her ear. "Closer, my dear." The figure in the bed looked almost right. Silver hair, thin hands. Only the breathing betrayed it, timed with the wind instead of the lungs. "What big eyes you have," the girl said, not fearfully but as accusation. "All the better to see you," answered the thing, teeth clicking behind civility. She smiled a bloodline smile and untied the hood. Beneath it, the mark of the moon gleamed faintly, crescented on her throat. "Then see," she whispered, and stepped forward. The thing leaned, jaws widening, and for once met what it expected to devour. Red, blurred with black. The room filled with a sound half growl, half hymn. When it cleared, only the cloak remained, folded neatly on the bed. Outside, something howled a note neither victory nor loss, but continuation. Morning found the forest calm. Mist unrolled between the trunks like gauze over a wound that will not close. The path shone faintly, paved in dew and memory. The villagers who dared enter found prints in the mud. One set human, one not, walking side by side until they vanished together at the stream. They said the curse was broken because people prefer endings, but the wind disagreed. It carried a new sound through the valley. low and sweet and terrifyingly content. In its note lived everything that had ever eaten or been eaten. It spoke of equilibrium, of inheritance, of hunger learning to sing. The red cloak passed to no one. It hung in the cottage window like a warning and a flag. Travelers swore it moved sometimes, swaying to a rhythm no breeze could claim. Children dared each other to touch the threshold. Those who did returned quiet, as if remembering a secret too vast for mouths. Under the next full moon, dogs howled in harmony with something unseen. A shepherd glimpsed two shapes running the ridge, one slender, one immense, both fast as thought. He crossed himself the old way and whispered thanks that they were running away. He did not notice the smaller shape glance back, smiling. Stories end where listeners blink. The forest does not. It waits behind your next breath, patient, wearing its new skin's fur, flesh, fiber optic light. The curse was never lifted. It simply learned translation. It speaks now in every warning told to every child. Keep to the path. Beware the stranger. Trust no voice that knows your name too well. And somewhere, when night balances perfectly on the edge of silence, the last howl rises not of pain, not of triumph, but of recognition. It is the sound of the story remembering itself, calling to whoever will listen. The red is not a warning. It's a mirror. Then the forest exhales. The echo folds into time, and darkness, ancient, patient, satisfied, closes its mouth around the world.